Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to you to this final session of INGSA 2024. So I am Shaheen Mutalatimul from Mauritius, and I'm part of the INGSA Africa Steering Committee. So for this next session, I'm very happy to introduce our esteemed plenary speaker, Professor Sujatha Raman, who holds the distinguished UNESCO Chair for Science Communication as a public good at the Australian National University's Centre for the Public Awareness of Science. In today's information age, understanding and using the overwhelming volume of available data and knowledge is one of humanity's most pressing challenges. And so, how do we, as individuals and as part of various societal and global frameworks, navigate this wealth of data and information to derive actionable insight and to support decision-making? So while it's tempting to simplify this challenge as a matter of mere supply and demand of information, evidence, and advice, such a view does overlook the critical role played by societal and cultural factors in mediating information. So how evidence is packaged and disseminated will significantly impact its reception and utilization. And I think the key word today is also public good. This is where I think ongoing and participatory communication emerges as essential, and engaging scientists, researchers, knowledge users, citizens in collaborative, transformative dialogue become key for meaningful progress. So to guide us through this very complex landscape, I am delighted to present Professor Sujatha Raman, the UNESCO Chair for Science Communication as a Public Good. Please join me in welcoming Professor Raman to this stage.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. You can tell I'm an academic because I won't be separated from my laptop, which actually sits very nicely over here. Okay, so first of all, I want to thank the organizers of this beautiful conference in Kigali, the INGSA conference, for giving me the opportunity today to share my thoughts on the transformation imperative and how we might bring an inclusive mindset to thinking about science advice at this fifth INGSA conference. Thanks to all of you in the audience, colleagues, friends, for sticking it deep into day two. I think the advantage that I have going at the end of such a series of really rich discussions is I can just summarize what various people have said, and I'm sure I'll do some of that, but perhaps I'll try and stir the pot a little bit, and we'll see how it goes in the interest of having hopefully a productive discussion. So before I get into my remarks, if you'll indulge me for a few minutes, I want to reflect first on the collaborations, the relationships that have got me here. I think it takes a village to make a professor, and this professor is certainly no exception. I think it's particularly the case with UNESCO chairs. Now, most UNESCO chairs, of course, are not funded by UNESCO. They don't work for UNESCO. And strictly speaking, I'm the UNESCO chair holder because it's never just one person. The UNESCO chair is actually a program of work with several colleagues. And so I would like to acknowledge my brilliant colleagues in the UNESCO chair program. Rini Astuti, Rita Aga, and Indigo Stridwick are all here, and you will have heard heard from them in previous sessions. Krista De Silva, Farana Hardcastle, Dan Santos couldn't be here, but I would like to thank them in their absence. And of course, the center which supports the chair, which is the Center for the Public Awareness of Science, fondly known as CPAS, which is also one of the sponsors of the conference. Now, as I take up this task of being the final plenary speaker, I can't help but feeling, acutely conscious, if you like, of the multiple allegiances and identities that I bring to this role. So obviously I represent the Australian National University, or ANU. The ANU, as I'm sure most of you know, is not in the United Kingdom. Although if any of you caught a glimpse of my badge, you might be for a moment a little bit confused because it says ANU and then United Kingdom below that. But the UK, of course, is also where I cut my teeth in academic terms over some 20 years or so and still maintain very strong ties to the country. And I will say much of what I've learned from about science advice, science policy relations, understanding technology in terms of its wider social relations. These are all fields I'll briefly draw from in my remarks today. And much of these, of course, I picked up in the UK. But of course, over the past 5 years, I've had the privilege of living and working on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, a place that's today known as Canberra, the capital of Australia. And I think this has brought me a new perspective, particularly on issues of equity and inclusion, which are central to what I will talk about. And it's these are issues that I think I would have said, oh, I know something about this, right? I work in this domain. But I don't think I ever grappled with those issues of equity in the kind of deeply historically embedded and culturally located way that Australia does so much to try and cultivate in its academics. Australia has also been very welcoming, giving me opportunities to connect with our Learned Academy, the incredible Australian Academy of Science, wider science government networks, things I think which would have been much harder to do in the UK. Finally, and I'm getting there to my remarks, I am, of course, of Indian origin, born and raised in South India, and this has undoubtedly influenced how I think about the transformation imperative and equity in ways I probably can't fathom myself. And while I can't claim any formal affiliation to Africa, I hope I have permission to draw upon my life-changing friendship and collaboration with Dr. Temilade Shesan, who's there somewhere. Temilade is at the University of Ibadan and a member of the program committee for this year's conference. And maybe if, I can say when I visited Lagos a few years back in connection with Temi's INGSA project, I do recall Dr. Doyin making me an honorary Nigerian. I hope my talk today won't make him withdraw that privilege. Okay, so all of this is to say, this larger network that I'm very proud to be part of has, of course, shaped my thinking. The usual disclaimers apply. Don't hold anybody else responsible for the propositions that I want to offer you today. So the question that I'm interested in is one that we have been grappling with over the past 2 days, and 10 years. But how do we need to think about expanding the type of evidence that's seen as relevant for science advice, especially given this transformation imperative? And I think what I want to underline there is we've been talking a lot about bringing, expanding the evidence field, if you like, bringing lots of disciplines together, working at the interfaces, all those kinds of things. But I do feel we need a central animating idea or principle. And I think, what better principle than equity? Right, equity, putting equity at the center of the transformation that that has been kind of implicit in what we've been talking about. It's certainly central to the SDGs. It's often treated as a separate pillar, and I'll have a few things to say about how we actually approach and think about and bring in questions of equity into the way in which we do science advice. So I have a few propositions, and so the first one is, I'd say equity. The idea of equity is as important for us as a community as it might be for those we seek to affect. And this is not only because we, the includers, as Connie put it this morning in the plenary, it's not just that we want to go out there and include others in the goodness of our hearts or whatever. But equity is important for us because it can give us an underpinning cultural norm about what kind of society do we want to live in. And therefore, in that light, what can we expect from science? What kind of science or science advice do we need? And I think equity provides and can provide a very powerful animating force, if you like, particularly to recognize that it's not enough to generate evidence, as I think a number of people have been saying. We have to make it meaningful. We have to make this type of evidence that we have been talking about considered to be the gold standard, if you like. And that requires work. And I think there are ways in which equity can help, give a fresh purpose to that goal of science advice, not as something that is an afterthought, that's separate from the biophysical questions that we often grapple with, but actually putting equity at the heart of planetary change, of the SDGs, as a cause of the crises that we are confronted with, as well as being central to the solutions. And so my second proposition picks up on that. And what I want to actually say, normally in my position as a social scientists are often seen as, the critics from the outside, people carping from the outside, if you like. But those of us who have been, very committed to the interface between science and policy, who have worked in communities like this one, I think I've been very struck from doing this kind of work that actually there are lots of interesting examples that speak to a really novel, a really fresh integration of questions of equity, which are seen as social questions, and questions of biophysical change, which are seen as, traditionally scientific questions. There's a lot of work in the kind of transdisciplinary imagination, which represent this kind of work. If I'd been a really traditional academic and wanted to use death by PowerPoint, I would have had one image, which is from this amazing paper on inequality in the biosphere by Hammond et al. 2018. And one of the things that they force us to think about is how inequality can be seen as a cause of Earth system change, as much as something we need to do about because of climate change and all the other crises. And why do they say this? Because, of course, it's got to do with aspirations for upward mobility, but also perceptions of fairness. I shouldn't have to give up my dream of a more comfortable life if you don't, right? Those sorts of things, animating, if you like, a relentless consumption of resources. They also point to market concentration as another example. So I think it's very striking that a number of environmental scientists, planetary, interdisciplinary sustainability scientists, in the broadest sense, from the social sciences to the biophysical sciences, are actually starting to rethink how we think about and how we represent the relationship between apparently external social factors and the other stuff that normally seems very real, right, like biodiversity loss, climate change, and so forth. So, and I think that's really good news. So let me turn to some kind of more specific examples around which to try tie my further propositions. I want to think a little bit deeper about what does it actually mean to put equity at the heart of this enterprise. And most of the examples that I want to offer will focus largely on the case of technological change or science advice for how we deal with technological change or technological transitions. So why technology? Technology innovation, of course, looms large in the imagination of equity, right? Most governments want to be make sure that they are well positioned to mobilize the power of AI, of other digital technologies, biotechnology, and so forth. And that's obviously the right thing to do. It's about promoting economic development in the hope of lifting people out of poverty. And let's not forget SDG 10, which often isn't mentioned as much as I expect, which is about reducing inequalities between and within countries, right? It's all about technology seen as very central to that goal. But if we probe this a little further, One of the things I think is a lot more challenging, and many of you have already spoken to this, is creating a system where practical questions about what does this emerging technology actually mean in this context for these people's lives in a particular setting, right? What do we actually need to do to deliver on the promise? And I think that's where the rubber hits the road. That's where things get more challenging and more complicated. And I think for that, my third proposition goes back to the central concept of transformation or transformative change, which is, of course, a major theme for the conference. So we have not heard maybe the phrase system change come up maybe as much as we might have expected. It was part of one of the panels that we organized, but transformation, as I understand it, this transformation imperative, calls for some sort of fundamental system change. And there are various ways in which we can describe that, but one of the things that is obviously critical, as I understand it, is that it signifies the ways in which developments in the global north and the global south, where they're going to be heading. As I understand the history of the SDGs, and we heard from one of the architects, one of the ambassadors yesterday who was central to the charting this, very radical vision of the SDGs. As I understand what the SDGs are trying to do, they are proposing contraction of various kinds in the global north and convergence. So, development in the global south so that we meet at some point, right? Like that's a very kind of maybe simplified way of thinking about it, but contract and converge, this idea that's been around for a long time, certainly ever since, climate change treaties were signed and so forth, they have been around. Maybe they haven't had as much impact as they should do. And one of the reasons I say that is because I think today, everybody in the global north driving an EV, an electric vehicle, seems to qualify as an example of system change. And I'm not sure that quite captures the spirit of the SDGs, of this kind of more contract and converge question, because of course everyone driving an EV, I don't have time to get into the details. It has come up in the conference before, but the huge material footprint, the resource extraction, and the social costs of that kind of picture, as opposed to thinking about reshaping mobility, forms of mobility in the global north. I think it's, that's clearly something that might be closer to this kind of contraction idea. It doesn't all have to be degrowth. There are other creative ways in which we could think about this in the global north. So I want to say, yes, science, technology, innovation, broadly speaking, are essential to this task. But my fourth proposition is we can't just solve these problems, the problems that the SDGs force us to think about and think about solutions of a better future. We can't just solve these with a science or technology-led strategy, right? We need science, we need technology, we need innovation, but it can't just be led by science or technology, particularly if it's operating in a kind of reductionist paradigm. And I think this came up in Jeremy's plenary talk this morning. I think there's plenty of evidence. It's been, demonstrated that, time and again that this is insufficient. It can be downright harmful in certain contexts. But again, the good news is I think we have the evidence to begin to make the case, and many of you have already been making a case for a different approach. What some people are calling knowledge co-production, and I'll give a couple of examples of that. But just to kind of really reiterate the point, why is, I want to just pick up say a little bit more, backtrack and say a little bit more about why a science or technology-led approach in the kind of business as usual format, why that's not enough. We've been talking about lived experience, we've been talking about storytelling, all of these things are critical, but let's not forget that we have evidence about lived experience that's been gathered by experts who are skilled in that process. So I think we should probably also start thinking about not just there's evidence and there's expertise and there's lived experience, but there are ways in which lived experience or aspects of lived experience can also be captured under the heading of evidence, if you like. So I do want to underline that. But my fifth proposition is that often there's a mismatch between, doesn't always have to be the case, but it does seem to happen, a mismatch between a scientific picture of the world, which flattens out difference, which tries to present, if you like, a universal picture, as you might see in modeling, and a mismatch between that picture and the realities of people's lives. Often people's lives at the margins. And the most notorious case that comes to my mind is the impact of the lockdown that was announced in India, which led to a major hardship for migrant workers who had no way of making a living, no transportation even to get back to the villages. And, you know, if you contrast that with certainly people like myself, I had the most cocooned existence living in Australia, where we hardly had any COVID cases in the first year. We had a lot of Zoom meetings in the middle of the night, maybe much of the day. But, you know, it was a much more privileged existence, if you like. So the idea that, you know, modeling the principles of lockdown, when they kind of work with a very simplified or insufficiently disaggregated picture of the human, of the public, you know, we get into trouble. And I think Connie mentioned several examples of this problem as well this morning. So that leads me to my sixth proposition, which is more specific to a mismatch when it comes to technology and technological innovation, a mismatch maybe between people's needs and priorities and the solutions that might be on offer. And I think here I want to pick up on a point about evidence and expanding evidence, which I want to say doesn't always mean gathering or even synthesizing more research. You don't always need to go to the AI to synthesize the, you know, the massive body of literature, the more and more papers that are coming out, because as others have said, you know, sometimes there are questions of the quality of the papers. Do we need all these papers actually to reach certain judgments? But sometimes maybe it's a very specific paper that you need, something that perhaps the AI, I don't know, those of you who are experts can say more about that, but something that might be missed in that kind of more average picture that you get. Sometimes it's the specific, it's the local, it's the more targeted evidence that's actually the more critical. And people like Dr. Shehsan at the University of Ibadan has been, you know, grappling with this for many years, and in a recent project funded by the International Science Council, you know, has done all this work showing that it's possible to go into informal settlements in South Africa and Zambia, work out the issues they face, the very specific issues different people face around energy, water, waste management, liaise with policymakers, with stakeholders, and work out possible solutions. And I think this very much operated with this idea that there's no one size fits all. We saw some examples with the Global Development Awards as well, I think, that exhibited that kind of thinking. Okay, I'm getting towards my end, the last couple of propositions. Seventh proposition is, I think in addition to thinking about local needs, local priorities, we do need to perhaps pay more attention to the systemic nature of the problems we face, and what that means for us in the science advice community in terms of anticipating the future consequences of what we choose to prioritize today. I think it's been very striking to me to read the Flipping the Science model. Many of you know that from the International Science Council, but one of the ways in which some of the tensions between, you know, different nexus issues that paper highlights, I think is really neatly illustrated with how we've approached the climate and energy transition. I think now we realize that energy transition comes at an environmental and social cost, right? Because of the material resources, minerals involved in supporting, you know, a complete reproduction of very wealthy industrialized lifestyles, reproducing existing ways of living with renewable energy, electrification, and so forth. And my colleague, Dr. Rini Astuti, has been investigating one side of this, one set of implications of this in Indonesia, which has, of course, gone through a boom in nickel production and processing as a result of the EV boom. I think there's also an irony here when we talk about transportation, trying to solve climate change problems, and you see like autonomous vehicles, for example, represented as a solution. And of course, these two, rely on tools that are hungry for resources, which in turn create social conflicts around material extraction, the use of water, in the longer term over biodiversity. And then these then become the problems that other science advisors then have to grapple with. So sometimes it feels like, part of the time we are promoting new tools like AI and so forth, or new emerging technological solutions. And then the other half of the time we have to grapple with the consequences of those very tools and what that means for, what we offer to policymakers. So in a way, particularly I think when it comes to AI and digital transformation, I think we need to think about guardrails, not just sort of internal to the algorithms, but what we choose to use AI for in the first place. I haven't seen a lot of discussion about, when do we need AI and maybe when not so much. There was a little bit of that in the AI panel, I think, yesterday, but kind of judicious use principles, which applies also, I think, to all of us. I think that would be something that maybe we should be working on. Eighth proposition, the answer to all of these challenges, systemic challenges that I've highlighted, of course, isn't to stop everything, right? It's not about saying, oh, we can't do any of this because, of course, mining communities also depend on for their livelihoods on mineral extraction, right? Whether it's artisanal mining, large company mines, and so forth. The energy transition challenge, of course, is a very real one. But the question is, when we see these projections about how much minerals we need to support an equitable energy transition, one of the questions maybe we should be asking ourselves in thinking about evidence for policy is, are these minerals that are being extracted, are they in fact meeting the needs of the people who are pointed to as, they lack electricity or they lack clean cooking fuels and so on and so forth. So sometimes I think this is where we get lost in the kind of massive projections of what we need at a universal level. Equity is very much part of those scenarios that the International Energy Agency, for example, is putting forward. But I think part of it is thinking about, is that actually going to be making a difference for people on the ground who, maybe continue to be impoverished or, where inequalities may be further deepened, if you like. Okay, so my ninth proposition, and then I've only got one more. Ninth proposition has to do with, maybe no surprise, I think it was already kind of foreshadowed, the role of public and community participation in all of this stuff. I think we've been talking quite a lot about the role of science in helping us navigate COVID, the pandemic. But I think we shouldn't forget the story that we can tell about the huge role of parts of the public, particularly community volunteers in acting in impoverished settings, acting to manage the impact of lockdowns on just the supply of food. I think, again, this is something the late Salimul Haq, the climate scientist and activist, has written very eloquently about in the case of India. In my case, I could either go to my supermarket or order food, right, but wasn't always possible. And so the amazing role of community volunteering to keep the food supply going in the face of lockdown, I think so, highlights a very kind of active role of community participation, represents a form of evidence, I think, that is relevant to how we think about the kind of recommendations that we have to offer. It doesn't mean that government responsibilities should be delegated to the public. That's not the point, right? That isn't the issue, but the idea is to tap into local expertise and knowledge. Okay, and then very finally, my last point in my example is I think it's been really refreshing and inspiring in many ways to see the fact that this idea of more kind of participatory science advice, it isn't any longer a pipe dream, a fantasy. It isn't just something that people have to make the case for. There is an ongoing movement to develop it, to run with it, make it a reality, experiment with it. And the example that I want to finish on is from my colleagues in Australia, from the Australian Academy of Science, where they have been doing several examples, several experiments, if you like, in expert elicitation, where they bring scientists together to produce something shared that can be presented to government. But recently, on a particularly complex and long-standing socio-environmental problem, the Australian Academy of Science took the, I thought, really bold step of bringing traditional owners, indigenous peoples together with these elite scientists, who are academy members, so they could learn from each other. And I think it was really striking for myself and Indigo Strudwick, who's also there and was involved in a kind of observation of how this process worked. I think it was very striking to us, my colleague Will Grant, who is not here, it was striking to the three of us that the indigenous representatives in these roundtables were very adept about thinking very holistically about the system, when they were asked to think about what do these interventions, for example, what do they mean for the system as a whole, the socio-environmental system as a whole. And for them, the system was country. This was their land, their country. And in many ways, there was so much that we could learn. Well, we as observers certainly, but also the other scientists could learn from this process. So I do want to highlight the foresight and the vision of Chris Anderson, Anna Maria Arabia, and Hayley Teasdale, who's not here. Chris and Anna Maria, I know many of you know them already, and they're in the audience somewhere. Okay. So as I move to a conclusion, I'm happy to say that these processes, participatory processes, none of them are perfect. And maybe as a final point, one of the things we should be paying more attention to in organizations like INGSA is to think about how do we train, or not facilitate, if you like, experts to disagree well. To engage with each other's perspectives and maybe think about reassessing our own perspective. And, this applies as much to myself as anybody else. It is rather striking to me that, in all the kind of training that we receive, certainly certainly as a researcher, this idea of looking at how does somebody else from, even down the corridor from yours, how do they think about it, let alone somebody in a different building, right? Or somebody who's not a scientist at all. These kinds of issues I think it's changing. Again, we heard this morning about efforts that some of the academies are putting in place to kind of broaden that kind of training that we get. But I think there is a bigger challenge here about maybe being comfortable with disagreement, but respectful disagreement. It feels like one of the reasons why there's so much that's going on Twitter, on trolling and misinformation and so forth, is because that seems to be the avenue, if you like, for a lot of people who might otherwise perhaps disagree quite respectfully. In a more kind of face-to-face environment, for example. It's not always possible to do this face-to-face, but certainly the idea of thinking harder about how we can learn to disagree well, and then work with that in terms of how we then inform and engage with both civil society and policymakers. I think that's a big challenge for the future. I'm sure we can learn from all the big science advisory bodies, the IPCC, IPBES, which, that is in fact what they've been doing. So maybe we should learn more about some of those methods and make that quite central to the process of science advice in the transformation imperative going forward. And so with that, I will stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Raman, for bringing your refreshing insight, I would say, on essential questions of equity and responsibilities of science practitioners and advisors to serve better, I would say. And thank you for your comment on disagreeing respectfully. I think this is something that we need to do more often. Yes. So we don't have much time, so I will take one very short question, and I will also invite you to have additional questions after our last panel. So one question from our audience, please. No questions? Okay.
Hi, Sujatha. Is it on? Can you hear me? Hi, Sujatha. Thank you so much for that. Are you struggling to hear me? Do I need
Can
to
you
shout?
speak up? Yeah.
Okay. Hello. Oh, right. There we go. Yes, thank you so much for that talk and your provocation. I'm thinking a little bit about what you said at the beginning about equity being an underlying principle about the way that the type of world that we want to live in. And maybe thinking about the example you gave of bringing different stakeholders together. How did they go about that? And how did you grapple with different people's idea of what would be equitable and what would be fair? And I'm particularly thinking in a global context and with issues like climate change, what I think different nations would think would be fair in terms of what should be done and what they should contribute will be quite different. So do we have ways of reconciling that to deal with some of these big problems?
Yeah. Thank you. Is that okay? Can you hear?
Yep.
So yeah, I think it's, obviously it's a huge challenge, right? And part of the way to deal with it is actually to get comfortable having those conversations in the first place, particularly in the context of science advice. I think that's part of it. One of the reasons I didn't get to talk about public good very much, but one of the reasons, the UNESCO Chair is called Science Communication for the Public Good is to try and revive, if you like, more of a sense of these kinds of conversations about how do we understand the public good, what's the role of science in relation to contributing to that wider public good. Obviously, again, the International Science Council has done some amazing work in making that connection, but I think there's a lot more work to be done. And I think, some people would define, so I'm co-organizing a workshop in the University of Sheffield about bringing back the good society, or ideas of the good society. And sometimes it feels a bit strange, we're facing all these big problems, planetary crisis, and is this like, fiddling while Rome burns kind of thing, right? But actually I want to say that those kinds of conversations may be really important, and through that, hopefully we can, I don't know how they will go, how such conversations will go, but we need to be willing to have them and to explore, for example, the idea of the good society as something that is a more equitable society, and what does that then look like, right? So I think the reason I gave the somewhat, not entirely facetious example of everyone driving an EV, because I do think actually the International Energy Agency, some of their projections are based on everyone driving a Tesla, more or less. So, is that the vision of equity that we are after? Is it something else, right? So I think that is, there's a lot of work to be done in that space, I think.
Thank you very much, Professor. Please join me in thanking Professor Raman for her very great speech. Thank you so much. Thank you.